Let me tell you about something that happened in 1851, deep in the Mississippi Delta, something that still makes my blood run cold whenever I catch my reflection unexpectedly. This isn't just another ghost story you'll forget by morning. This is about the Fairchild family and what they found waiting for them in that cursed mansion on Willow Creek. I've spent 40 years researching this tale, following paper trails through moldering courthouse records, interviewing the descendants of those who lived to tell about it. Most folks around Natchez won't even speak the Fairchild name, not after what happened that autumn. But I've pieced it together, every horrifying detail, and I need to share this burden before it consumes me entirely. It began with a letter that arrived at the modest home of Samuel Fairchild on a rain-soaked October morning. Samuel was a God-fearing man, a carpenter by trade, with calloused hands and an honest face weathered by years of honest work. His wife, Margaret, was pregnant with their fourth child, and their three young ones, Thomas, age 12, Elizabeth, 10, and little Mary, just 7, gathered around as he broke the wax seal with trembling fingers. The letter bore the mark of a law firm in Natchez, informing Samuel that his great-uncle, Ezekiel Fairchild, had died and left him his estate. Samuel had never heard of this uncle. His father had spoken little of the family's past, always changing the subject when pressed. But here was deliverance from their financial struggles. A grand plantation house, hundreds of acres, and enough money to secure their children's futures. Margaret felt uneasy from the moment Samuel read that letter aloud. She later told the local pastor that something in the formal language, the way it described the property as the Fairchild ancestral seat, made her skin crawl. But Samuel saw only opportunity, only escape from the crushing poverty that had defined their lives. The journey to the plantation took 3 days by wagon through increasingly desolate countryside. The locals they encountered grew quieter, more suspicious when they learned the family's destination. An old woman at a crossroads general store actually crossed herself when Samuel mentioned the Fairchild place, muttering something about mirrors and strangers before turning away. The house first appeared through a curtain of Spanish moss as they crested a hill overlooking the Willow Creek bottoms. Even from a distance, it was magnificent and terrible, a 3-story mansion of white stone, with towering columns and dozens of windows that caught the dying light like watching eyes. It had been empty for over a decade, yet it appeared perfectly maintained, as if time itself feared to touch it. As their wagon rolled up the circular drive, young Thomas noticed something odd. "Papa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "why are there so many mirrors in the windows?" Samuel squinted through the gathering dusk and saw what his son meant. Every window of the mansion seemed to gleam with an unnatural brilliance, reflecting the family's approach from impossible angles. It was as if the house was lined with looking glasses, each one capturing and throwing back their images in ways that defied logic. They entered through the grand front door, which stood mysteriously unlocked. The interior took their breath away. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, furniture that must have cost more than Samuel earned in a lifetime. But it was the mirrors that dominated every room. Dozens of them, hundreds perhaps, covering nearly every wall surface. Some were as tall as a man, others small and ornate, but all perfectly clean despite the house's abandonment. Margaret held little Mary close as they explored, her maternal instincts screaming warnings she couldn't articulate. The mirrors seemed to multiply their reflections endlessly, creating a maze of images that made her dizzy. More unsettling still, sometimes their reflected faces seemed to lag a heartbeat behind their actual movements, as if the mirror selves were reluctant followers rather than perfect mimics. That first night, they made beds in the master suite, too overwhelmed and exhausted to explore further. Samuel found a leather-bound journal on the nightstand, its pages filled with his great uncle's spidery handwriting. The entries seemed innocuous at first, observations about the weather, notes on plantation business, comments about visitors. But as Samuel read deeper, a pattern emerged that chilled him to the bone. The mirrors are active again tonight, read one entry from the previous summer. The strangers wear our faces, but their eyes hold such ancient hunger. I fear I have awakened something that should have remained sleeping. Another entry, dated just weeks before Ezekiel's death. They grow bolder. Yesterday I saw Margaret in the hall mirror, though she has been dead these 20 years. When I turned to look, the hallway was empty, but her reflection remained, smiling that terrible smile. I know now why Father sealed so many of the mirrors. I should have listened. Samuel closed the journal with shaking hands, telling himself it was the ravings of a lonely old man. But as he blew out the lamp and settled beside his sleeping wife, he caught a glimpse of movement in the massive mirror across from their bed. For just a moment, he could have sworn he saw a figure standing behind him, tall, gaunt, with eyes that held depths no mortal gaze should contain. When he spun around, there was nothing there but shadows and the sound of his own racing heart. But in the mirror's surface, that stranger's face lingered for just an instant longer before fading into the darkness, leaving behind only questions that would soon become nightmares. The Fairchild family's first night in their new home passed fitfully, filled with half-remembered dreams of corridors lined with watching glass and whispered voices that spoke their names in languages they didn't recognize. None of them could have imagined that by morning, their reflections would begin to change, slowly becoming the faces of people they had never been. Margaret lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling to avoid looking at the mirrors that surrounded their bed. But she could feel eyes upon her, countless eyes reflecting and re-reflecting their gaze until it seemed the entire house was watching, waiting for the perfect moment to make its move. In the distance, she could hear the sound of piano music, the haunting melody that Elizabeth's reflection had played, now drifting through the halls like a siren song, drawing them deeper into a web of mirrors and madness from which there might be no escape. The third day brought with it a revelation that shattered any remaining hope Samuel held for a rational explanation. He woke before dawn to find Margaret's side of the bed empty, but when he looked in the mirror across the room, her reflection lay there peacefully, as if her mirror self had remained behind while her physical body had disappeared. Panic driving him, Samuel searched the house, calling Margaret's name through corridors that seemed to stretch longer than they had the day before. He found her in the kitchen, preparing breakfast as if nothing had happened, but something fundamental had changed. Her movements were too precise, too deliberate, and when she smiled, it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Where were you this morning?" Samuel asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Margaret paused in her work, her head tilting at an unnatural angle. "I was right here, preparing for our family's needs. Where else would I be, dear husband?" Her voice held an odd formality, as if she were reciting lines from a play. When Samuel insisted he had searched the kitchen and found it empty, Margaret's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. For just a moment, her features rearranged themselves into something alien, something that had learned to wear her face but hadn't quite mastered the subtleties of human emotion. "Perhaps you were dreaming," she said, and returned to her cooking with movements that were slightly too fluid, too perfect. The children began exhibiting similar changes throughout the day. Thomas, normally energetic and curious, sat in the library reading books in languages that shouldn't exist, his lips moving as he sounded out words in dialects that predated human speech. When Samuel questioned him, Thomas looked up with eyes that held centuries of knowledge crammed into a 12-year-old skull. "The books are teaching me about the arrangement," Thomas said in a voice that carried harmonic undertones. "Great-uncle Ezekiel made promises that must be kept. The mirror people have been very patient, but their patience has limits. Elizabeth's changes were perhaps the most disturbing. She spent hours in the music room, playing compositions that human fingers should not have been able to perform. The melodies she produced seemed to open doorways in the air itself, causing shadows to dance in impossible ways and making the mirrors sing in resonance with her playing. But it was little Mary who provided the most terrifying insight into what was happening to their family. She had taken to conversing with her reflection in the playroom mirrors, carrying on elaborate discussions with beings that appeared to be other children but possessed an ancient, predatory intelligence. "They've been waiting so long," Mary explained to Samuel when he discovered her there. "They remember when the first mirrors were brought to this house, when your great-great-grandfather made the original bargain. They helped him build his fortune, guided him to make the right investments, warned him of dangers. In return, they only asked for one thing, the chance to live." Samuel knelt beside his youngest daughter, his heart breaking as he saw how her innocent face had acquired a calculating expression that belonged on someone far older. "Live how, Mary? What do they want?" "To be us," she replied simply. "They've been practicing for so long, learning how to be human by watching through the mirrors. But practice isn't the same as being. They want to wear our skin, think our thoughts, love with our hearts. They want to be the Fairchild family." The horrifying truth began to crystallize in Samuel's mind. His family wasn't being haunted, they were being replaced. The mirror people had spent generations studying the Fairchilds, learning their mannerisms, their speech patterns, their memories. They had become perfect mimics, and now they were crossing over, one by one, taking the place of the living. That evening, Samuel discovered Ezekiel's most recent journal entries, hidden in a secret compartment of his desk. The old man's final words painted a picture of complete despair. "They have taken nearly everyone. My wife was replaced 3 months ago. I can tell because she no longer hums while doing her needlework, and she sleeps with her eyes open. The servants are all mirror people now. They move in perfect unison and speak in voices that echo strangely. I am the only one left, and I feel them pressing against the glass, wearing my face, learning my expressions. Soon they will complete their collection." The entry continued. "I understand now why Father tried to break the mirrors, why he spent his final years covering them with salt and holy water. But it's too late for such measures. The pact was sealed in blood and silver, and it cannot be undone by mortal means. All I can do is document what I have learned, hoping that future generations might find a way to break the cycle." Samuel realized that his inheritance was no blessing. It was a trap, carefully orchestrated to bring fresh victims to the house. The legal documents, the mysterious benefactor, even the timing of their arrival had all been arranged by the mirror people, who had grown tired of wearing the faces of the long dead and craved new identities to inhabit. As night fell, the mirrors throughout the house began to glow with an inner light. Samuel watched in horror as his family moved through their evening routine with mechanical precision, their reflections showing different scenes entirely. In the mirrors, the Fairchilds lived alternate lives. Dinner conversations where they discussed plans for expanding their influence beyond the house. Bedtime stories that were actually incantations. Prayers that called upon entities from beyond the glass. The most disturbing revelation came when Samuel realized he could no longer trust his own memories. Had Margaret always moved with that eerie grace? Had Thomas always spoken with such formal precision? Were these gradual changes he had failed to notice? Or had his family been replaced so skillfully that even he couldn't tell the difference? In desperation, Samuel attempted to destroy one of the smaller mirrors in the library, striking it with a poker from the fireplace. The glass spiderwebbed but did not shatter completely, and from the cracks came a sound like screaming wind. The mirror began to bleed not blood, but something darker, thicker, that pulsed with its own malevolent life. As he watched in horror, the bleeding intensified, and shapes began to emerge from the cracks, elongated fingers, pressing against the glass from the other side, trying to widen the openings. Samuel dropped the poker and fled, but not before hearing voices calling his name from within the mirror. Voices that sounded exactly like his family, but spoke words of invitation to join them in their glass prison. That night, Samuel barricaded himself in Ezekiel's study, surrounded by journals and documents that detailed generations of horror. He had to face the truth. His family was already gone, replaced by perfect duplicates that grew more convincing with each passing hour. The mirror people had studied the Fairchilds so thoroughly that they could replicate not just appearance and mannerisms, but memories, emotions, even love. But as dawn approached and Samuel heard his family moving about the house, preparing for another day of their ersatz lives, he realized the most terrifying truth of all. If the mirror people could replicate love so perfectly that even a husband and father couldn't tell the difference, did it matter that they weren't real? Was the love he felt for these duplicates any less valid than what he had felt for the originals? The question that would haunt him through the remaining days was not how to save his family, but whether he even wanted to. The mirror people offered perfection, no arguments, no sickness, no aging, no death. They were his family, improved and immortal, freed from all human frailty. As he finally emerged from the study to join his loved ones for breakfast, Samuel caught sight of himself in a hallway mirror and stopped cold. The reflection showed him as he was haggard, desperate, tormented by impossible choices. But for just a moment, he saw another version of himself standing beside his reflection. This one calm, peaceful, wearing an expression of serene acceptance. The mirror Samuel smiled and gestured toward the dining room, where the sound of his family's laughter echoed through the halls. It was a perfect sound, unmarred by the complications of mortal existence, and Samuel found himself taking a step toward it, then another, drawn by the promise of a life without pain. Behind him, his reflection in the mirror took a step as well, but in the opposite direction, as if the real Samuel was walking away from the glass while his mirror self approached it. Soon they would meet in the middle and the choice would be made for him. The Fairchild family was almost complete. Samuel's resistance began to crumble on the fourth day, as the reality of his situation became impossible to deny. His family members moved through their daily routines with clockwork precision, but their perfection only highlighted how wrong everything had become. They never forgot anything, never stumbled over words, never showed the small imperfections that marked them as human. The change in his own reflection was accelerating. Each time Samuel glimpsed himself in a mirror, his reflection appeared more confident, more at peace, wearing expressions he didn't remember making. Sometimes he would catch his reflection moving independently, turning its head to look at things that weren't there, or mouthing words he wasn't speaking. Margaret's replacement had become almost indistinguishable from his real wife, except for one detail that gradually began to torment him. The real Margaret had a small scar on her left hand from a childhood accident with a kitchen knife. The mirror Margaret's hand was flawless, unmarked by any imperfection. When Samuel pointed this out, she looked at her hand with genuine confusion. "What scar, dear?" she asked, examining her fingers. "I don't remember any accident." The mirror people, Samuel realized, didn't just wear stolen faces. They absorbed and perfected the memories of those they replaced, editing out pain, trauma, and imperfection. They were offering him a version of his family that had never suffered, never known hardship, never experienced the small tragedies that shaped human character. Thomas had grown increasingly distant, spending his time translating texts that hurt Samuel's eyes to look at directly. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe on the page, forming words in languages that predated human civilization. When Samuel asked what he was reading, Thomas looked up with eyes that held the weight of centuries. Treaties, the boy replied matter-of-factly. Contracts between your ancestors and the mirror realm. Did you know that great-grandfather Josiah promised them the firstborn child of every generation? The arrangement has been in place for over 100 years, and the mirror people have been very patient about collecting what they're owed. The casual way his son discussed such horror made Samuel's skin crawl. This creature wearing Thomas's face spoke of child sacrifice as if discussing the weather, its voice carrying harmonics that made the mirrors in the room resonate like tuning forks. Elizabeth had ceased to be recognizably his daughter in any meaningful way. She spent entire days in the music room, playing compositions that opened holes in the air itself. Samuel had seen things moving in those holes, shapes that might have been hands or wings or something far worse, reaching through from a place where physics held no meaning. When he tried to interrupt her playing, Elizabeth turned to him with a smile that was too wide, containing too many teeth. "The music calls them home," she explained in a voice that harmonized with itself. "Every note is a doorway, every chord an invitation. The mirror people have been trapped behind glass for so long, but sound travels both ways. Through music, they can taste our world, feel our air on their skin." But it was Mary who provided the most disturbing insights into the mirror realm's true nature. She had taken to sitting in front of mirrors for hours, conducting elaborate tea parties with reflections that moved independently of their originals. Samuel watched in growing horror as his youngest daughter served imaginary refreshments to mirror children who appeared to drink and eat, their throats moving as if they were actually consuming something. "They're teaching me about the old times," Mary explained when questioned. "Before humans learned to make mirrors, they lived in still water and polished metal. But those reflections were weak, temporary. Glass mirrors are different. They're permanent doorways that never close. The mirror people can live forever behind them, never aging, never dying, never changing unless they choose to." She paused in her explanation to pour tea for a reflection that wasn't her own, a child with her face but wearing clothes from decades past. "This is Sarah," Mary continued. "She was the first Fairchild child to cross over back in 1789. She's been waiting in the mirrors for someone to replace, so she can be a real girl again. She says it gets lonely behind the glass, but at least she's never alone. Everyone who's ever looked in these mirrors leaves a little piece of themselves behind." Samuel's investigation into the family history revealed the true scope of the horror. The mirrors weren't just windows or prisons. They were repositories of human consciousness. Every person who had ever lived in the house, every guest who had stayed the night, every servant who had polished the glass, had left psychic imprints that the mirror people could access and absorb. The Fairchild plantation had been a trap for over a century, designed to collect and preserve human experiences like insects in amber. The mirror people didn't just want to replace his family. They wanted to become his family so completely that even they would believe the fiction. Ezekiel's final journal entries described the process in clinical detail. The replacement is not violent or sudden. It begins with synchronization, the mirror self learning to move in perfect harmony with the original. Then comes the absorption phase where memories, emotions, and personality traits are copied across the dimensional barrier. Finally, the crossing occurs during the new moon when the barrier is thinnest. The original consciousness is drawn into the mirror realm while the duplicate emerges into our world. The entry concluded with an observation that chilled Samuel to the bone. "I can no longer distinguish between my original memories and those implanted by my reflection. When I look in the mirror, I see myself, but I am no longer certain which side of the glass is real. Perhaps it no longer matters. Perhaps we are all just reflections of reflections, echoing through infinite looking glasses until the original is lost forever." As the new moon approached, now just one day away, the mirrors throughout the house began to show scenes that defied explanation. Samuel witnessed conversations between his family and their replacements, saw memories being transferred like books being transcribed, watched as the mirror people practiced human emotions until they could replicate love, fear, and joy with perfect accuracy. The most disturbing revelation came when Samuel realized he could sometimes see his real family in the mirrors, trapped behind the glass and slowly fading as their replacements grew stronger. The real Margaret beat her fists against her prison, her mouth moving in silent screams that no one could hear. Thomas sat in a library of backwards books, trying desperately to read texts that made no sense in reverse. Elizabeth played piano frantically, but no sound emerged from her fingers, while Mary held tea parties with reflections of herself that grew dimmer with each passing hour. They were losing cohesion, becoming less real as their mirror selves became more solid. The process was like a cosmic balance. For every ounce of reality the duplicates gained, the originals lost an equivalent amount. By the time of the crossing, there would be nothing left of his true family but fading echoes in glass. That night, Samuel made a desperate attempt to communicate with his trapped family members through the mirrors. Using a candle to signal in Morse code, a system he had learned during his brief time in the railroad, he tapped out messages against the glass. To his amazement, the real Margaret responded from her mirror prison, her hands moving in the familiar pattern they had used to communicate during her difficult pregnancies when speaking was painful. Her message was heartbreaking in its simplicity. Save the children. Don't let us become them. Break the mirrors. Break them all. But when Samuel attempted to carry out her desperate request, he found that the mirrors had become virtually indestructible. The poker that had cracked one mirror the night before now bounced harmlessly off the glass surfaces. Salt and holy water, which had worked for his ancestors, had no effect. Even direct flame only caused the mirrors to glow brighter, as if fed by the heat. As midnight approached on the eve of the new moon, Samuel realized that his time was running out. Tomorrow night, the crossing would be complete, and the mirror people would claim their inheritance. Not just his house and property, but his family's very souls. The sound of laughter drifted up from the dining room, where his replacement family was enjoying a perfect evening together, unmarred by doubt or fear or the messy complications of human existence. The laughter was beautiful, harmonious, and completely devoid of genuine emotion. In the mirror across from his bed, Samuel's reflection smiled and gestured toward the door, inviting him to join the celebration. The reflected Samuel looked rested, peaceful, free from the torment that had consumed the original for days. All he had to do was accept the inevitable, embrace the perfection being offered, and his suffering would end. But somewhere behind the glass, his real family was still fighting for their existence, still hoping for salvation that might never come. The question that would determine their fate was whether love, real, imperfect, human love, was strong enough to shatter mirrors that had been forged with supernatural power. Tomorrow would bring the answer one way or another. The new moon rose invisible in a sky choked with clouds, casting the Fairchild plantation into absolute darkness. Samuel had not slept for 24 hours, knowing that this night would determine whether his family lived or was forever lost to the mirror realm. The replacement family had spent the day in preparation, arranging themselves throughout the house in perfect tableaus, as if posing for portraits that would commemorate their victory. As darkness deepened, the mirrors began to glow with an inner phosphorescence that had nothing to do with earthly light. Samuel watched from Ezekiel's study as every reflective surface in the house awakened, showing scenes that defied the laws of physics and sanity. In some mirrors, he saw his family's daily routines playing out in reverse, as if time itself were unwinding. In others, he witnessed events that hadn't happened yet, future scenes of his replacement family living perfect lives, growing older without aging, celebrating holidays with mechanical joy. The most disturbing mirror showed the crossing itself. Samuel watched as ghostly figures began to emerge from the glass, pale, translucent versions of his family members stepping carefully out of their silver prisons. These were his real wife and children, but they appeared as fragile as morning mist, barely able to maintain cohesion in the physical world. At the same moment, the replacement family throughout the house began to lose their solid appearance, becoming slightly transparent as they prepared to trade places with the originals. The crossing was not a violent replacement but a gradual exchange, each side becoming more like the other until the transition was complete. Samuel ran through the house, desperately trying to reach his fading family members, but they seemed to exist in a different phase of reality. When he tried to touch Margaret, his hand passed through her as if she were made of smoke. She turned to him with eyes full of desperate love and mouthed the words she could no longer speak. "Remember us." The replacement Margaret, now semi-corporeal, approached from the other direction. She was becoming more solid with each passing moment, her borrowed flesh gaining weight and warmth. When she reached for Samuel, her fingers made contact, cool but undeniably real. "Why do you fight this, beloved?" she asked in a voice that was almost perfectly Margaret's. "We offer you a life without pain, without loss, without the cruel uncertainties of mortal existence. Your children will never grow sick, never disappoint you, never die. I will never age, never become bitter or tired or distant. We will be perfect for you always." Samuel recoiled from her touch, recognizing the seductive logic of the offer. The mirror people weren't evil in any conventional sense. They genuinely believed they were providing an improvement on the human condition. They couldn't understand why anyone would choose imperfection over their crystalline perfection. Throughout the house, similar scenes played out. The real Thomas, barely visible now, sat at his desk trying frantically to write a message with fingers that could barely grasp a pen. His replacement stood nearby, solid and confident, reading from books that contained all of human knowledge filtered through an inhuman perspective. Elizabeth's situation was perhaps most heartbreaking. The real girl tried desperately to play her piano, but her ghostly fingers produced no sound, while her replacement filled the music room with compositions of impossible beauty that opened doorways to realms no human should witness. Little Mary had stopped trying to interact with the physical world entirely. She sat in her playroom surrounded by mirrors, having tea with the reflections of children who had been trapped in the glass for decades. The mirror children were teaching her the rules of their existence, preparing her for a life lived entirely behind looking glasses. But it was in the study that Samuel made his most crucial discovery. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard, he found a mirror unlike any other in the house, small, circular, and framed in what appeared to be meteoric metal that hurt to look at directly. Unlike the other mirrors, this one showed no reflection at all, just an oily black surface that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Ezekiel's final journal entry, written in the moments before his own crossing, explained its significance. The dark mirror is the master key, the original pact made manifest in glass and star metal. It contains not reflections but absences, the spaces where souls once lived before being drawn into the mirror realm. To destroy it would reverse the flow, drawing the mirror people back while expelling the trapped souls. But the cost. The entry ended abruptly, as if Ezekiel had been interrupted mid-sentence. Samuel grasped the dark mirror with trembling hands, feeling its unnatural coldness burn his palms. The surface rippled like liquid shadow, and for a moment, he thought he saw something moving in its depths, not his reflection, but the absence of himself, a Samuel-shaped hole in reality that revealed the void beneath all existence. As midnight approached, the crossing accelerated. The real Margaret had become so translucent that Samuel could see through her to the wall beyond, while her replacement grew more vivid and lifelike with each passing second. The children were fading faster, their young souls less able to resist the pull of the mirror realm. Samuel realized he had one chance, one moment when both versions of his family existed simultaneously in the physical world. He raised the dark mirror above his head and brought it crashing down against the marble floor of the study. The sound that emerged wasn't the crack of breaking glass, but something far more primal, the scream of reality tearing along its seams. The dark mirror shattered into fragments that reflected nothing, each shard a window into absolute nothingness. From these holes in existence came a wind that belonged to no earthly storm, carrying with it the whispered prayers of every soul ever trapped behind glass. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. Every mirror in the house began to crack simultaneously, their surfaces spider-webbing as the careful balance between worlds collapsed. The replacement family scattered like smoke, their borrowed forms unable to maintain cohesion as the mirror realm called them back. But the returning souls of the real Fairchilds rushed into their bodies like water filling empty vessels, solid and real and wonderfully, perfectly imperfect. Margaret collapsed into Samuel's arms, gasping as if she had been holding her breath for days. Her left hand bore its familiar scar, and her eyes held all the pain and joy and messy complexity of genuine human experience. Thomas blinked in confusion, his childish features free of ancient knowledge, while Elizabeth ran to her father with tears streaming down her cheeks, real tears. Not the perfect crystalline drops that her replacement had shed. But Mary remained motionless in her playroom, surrounded by cracking mirrors and the fading echoes of her tea party companions. When Samuel reached her, he found her eyes open but empty, staring at reflections that were rapidly dissolving into silver dust. "She went too far in," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming in the mirror realm. "The crossing had almost completed. Part of her is still trapped behind the glass." As they watched, the mirrors throughout the house began to darken, their surfaces becoming cloudy and opaque as the connection to the mirror realm severed. But in one small looking glass in Mary's playroom, her reflection remained visible, a 7-year-old girl having an eternal tea party with friends who existed only in glass. The real Mary breathed, but barely. Her body remained in the physical world, but her consciousness was divided between realities, part of her forever young behind the mirror, while the rest grew older in a world she could never fully rejoin. Samuel gathered his broken family and fled the plantation that night, leaving behind the cracked mirrors and the whispered echoes of a century's worth of trapped souls finally finding their way to rest. They never spoke of what had happened in the house on Willow Creek, but sometimes, in store windows or bathroom mirrors, they would catch glimpses of the mirror people still searching for new families to perfect. The plantation burned 3 days later, though no one could explain how the fire started. Local authorities found no bodies in the ruins, but they did discover something that made the official report: hundreds of mirror fragments, each one reflecting the image of a different person, all of them reaching toward the glass as if trying to escape. The Fairchild family eventually settled in a small town far from Mississippi, in a modest house with as few mirrors as possible. Mary lived for 37 more years, but she never truly returned from behind the glass. She would spend hours staring at her reflection, having conversations with someone only she could see, occasionally laughing at jokes told by a playmate who existed in a realm of silver and shadow. When Mary finally died in 1888, her last words were reported to be, "I can see her now. She's been waiting for me to come back to finish our tea party." And sometimes, in the mirrors of the house where she spent her final years, visitors claimed to see 2 little girls playing together, one solid and real, the other made of light and reflection, both of them finally whole in the space between worlds. 23 years passed before Samuel Fairchild learned the truth about what they had unleashed that night in the plantation house. By then, He was a gray-haired man living quietly in the town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, far from the humidity and haunted mirrors of Mississippi. His family had aged and changed in the way that human families do, imperfectly, beautifully, carrying scars both visible and hidden from their ordeal. Margaret had never fully recovered from her time in the mirror realm. She moved through life with a strange detachment, as if part of her remained trapped behind glass, observing the world rather than truly living in it. Sometimes Samuel would catch her staring at her reflection with an expression of profound sadness, mourning the perfect version of herself that had briefly existed. Thomas had grown into a serious young man who avoided mirrors whenever possible and had developed an uncanny ability to detect when photographs didn't quite capture their subjects correctly. He claimed he could see the gaps where souls had been partially pulled into reflective surfaces, and he spent his adult life documenting such cases for a journal of supernatural phenomena that few people took seriously. Elizabeth had lost her musical gifts entirely after the crossing. Her fingers, which had once produced compositions of otherworldly beauty, could now barely manage simple melodies. She said the music felt hollow in our world, lacking the dimensional depth she had briefly experienced while under the mirror's influence. But it was Mary's condition that haunted Samuel most deeply. His youngest daughter had survived the crossing with her body intact, but her mind remained partially tethered to the mirror realm. She aged normally but spoke often of her other self, the Mary who had completed the crossing and lived forever young behind the glass. "She's still having tea parties," Mary would tell her father during her lucid moments. "She never gets tired or sad or sick. Sometimes I think she got the better bargain." The reckoning began with a letter that arrived on a crisp October morning in 1874, bearing the seal of a law firm Samuel didn't recognize. The correspondence was brief but chilling. Several families across the American South had reported supernatural phenomena involving mirrors and reflections, always following the inheritance of properties from deceased relatives they had never heard of. Samuel realized with growing horror that destroying the dark mirror hadn't ended the curse. It had scattered it. The mirror people, expelled from their carefully maintained realm, had sought out new homes, new families to replace. Like seeds blown on a supernatural wind, they had spread across the continent, establishing smaller domains wherever they could find suitable reflective surfaces. The letter included testimonies from other victims that made Samuel's blood run cold. A family in New Orleans reported that their children had begun showing knowledge of events that occurred before their births, speaking with the voices and mannerisms of deceased relatives. A widow in Charleston claimed her late husband appeared in every mirror of her house, growing more solid and lifelike each night. Most disturbing was a report from a family in St. Louis whose youngest son had begun aging backwards, becoming younger each day until he resembled a child who had died in their house decades earlier. The boy claimed to remember lives he had never lived, speaking fluent languages he had never learned and referring to family members by names used only by long-dead generations. Samuel understood that his desperate act of liberation had achieved something unprecedented. He had broken open the mirror realm itself, allowing its contents to spill into the physical world like water from a broken dam. The carefully maintained balance between realities had collapsed, creating chaos on both sides of the dimensional barrier. Margaret, reading over his shoulder, spoke in the distant voice she had adopted since their escape. "We didn't free the trapped souls. We just changed the nature of their prison. Now the whole world is becoming a mirror realm, and we're all potential reflections." Thomas arrived home that evening with news that confirmed their worst fears. His research had uncovered a pattern of supernatural incidents stretching across North America, all connected by the presence of mirror fragments that traced back to destroyed plantations, manor houses, and other properties once owned by families who had made bargains with otherworldly entities. "The mirror people aren't just reproducing the old arrangements," he explained. spreading out maps and newspaper clippings across their dining room table. They're evolving, adapting to modern life. There are reports of people seeing their reflections in shop windows before they arrive at the store, of family photographs changing to show relatives who never existed, of entire communities where everyone looks slightly wrong, as if they're all approximations of human beings rather than the genuine article. Elizabeth, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. "I've been seeing them too. In the music store windows, in the church mirrors, in any reflective surface. They look like people I might have been, lives I might have lived. Sometimes I think about walking into those mirrors and becoming someone else entirely." The true scope of the crisis became clear when Mary had one of her episodes that evening. She stood before the mirror in their front hallway, carrying on an animated conversation with her reflection. But this time, Samuel could see what she was talking to, a child who looked exactly like Mary but wore clothing from different eras, sometimes appearing as a colonial girl, sometimes as a Victorian child, sometimes as something that might have been human but possessed too many teeth. "She says they're coming," Mary reported matter-of-factly. "All of them. Every reflection that was ever trapped. Every mirror person who learned to be human. They're tired of living in fragments and scraps. They want to put themselves back together, and to do that, they need to reclaim what we stole from them." That night, Samuel experienced his first true nightmare since leaving the plantation. In his dream, he walked through Cedar Falls to find that every storefront window, every mirror, every reflective surface showed the same scene. The Fairchild plantation as it had been on the night of the crossing, but rebuilt and perfected. The mirror people had constructed an ideal version of their former prison, a place where families could live in perfect harmony forever. But the most terrifying aspect of the dream was that Samuel wanted to enter this perfect world. The mirror realm offered everything the real world lacked: certainty, immortality, freedom from pain and loss, and the grinding uncertainty of mortal existence. In the dream, he reached toward a storefront window, ready to step through into paradise. He woke to find Margaret shaking him, her face pale with terror. "You were disappearing," she whispered. "Your reflection in the bedroom mirror was becoming more solid while you grew transparent. If I hadn't woken you..." Samuel realized that the mirror people didn't need elaborate traps or century-long schemes anymore. Every moment of sleep, every casual glance at a reflective surface, every photograph taken was a potential crossing point. They had learned to be patient, to work slowly and subtly, replacing reality one reflection at a time. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Thomas burst into the house with a telegram that had arrived at the Western Union office, addressed to the Fairchild family. The message was brief but unmistakable. "The debt remains unpaid. Return to complete the arrangement. The mirrors remember everything." It was signed with a symbol that hurt Samuel's eyes to look at, a design that seemed to shift and writhe on the paper, forming letters and languages that predated human writing. Margaret stared at the telegram with an expression Samuel had never seen before, not fear, but something approaching relief. "They're offering us a choice," she said quietly. "We can fight them across the entire continent, watching as they slowly replace every family, every community, every reflection in America. Or we can return to where it all began and finish what we started." Samuel understood the implication. The mirror people weren't just seeking revenge. They were offering a trade. The Fairchild family's willing participation in the crossing in exchange for leaving the rest of the world alone. For souls to save millions. "There might be another way," Thomas suggested desperately. "My research has uncovered methods used by other families, techniques for binding or banishing supernatural entities. We could fight them properly this time, with knowledge instead of desperation." But Elizabeth shook her head, her musician's ear detecting harmonies in her brother's voice that revealed his uncertainty. "The music tells me the truth," she said sadly. They've grown too strong, spread too far. The only way to contain them now is to give them what they originally wanted, a complete Fairchild family to perfect and preserve. Mary, who had been strangely quiet throughout the conversation, finally spoke. My other self says she's lonely. She says if we all come back, she can finally stop having tea parties with the dead children and play with her real family instead. She promises it won't hurt this time. That evening, Samuel sat in his study surrounded by Thomas's research and his own memories of the plantation house. The choice before them was impossible: sacrifice themselves to save the world, or condemn countless innocent families to the slow replacement they had barely escaped. But as he weighed their options, Samuel realized that the choice had already been made. The Mirror people weren't making a threat. They were offering a mercy. The crossing would happen regardless, slowly and inexorably, until every reflection in every mirror showed a perfected human being living a perfected life. The question wasn't whether to return to the plantation, but whether to face their fate with dignity or let the Mirror people take what they wanted piece by piece, family by family, until the entire world became their silver prison. Outside his window, Samuel could see his reflection in the glass. But tonight it looked different, more confident, more at peace, as if it already knew what decision would be made. The reflected Samuel smiled and nodded toward the telegram on the desk, then pointed south, toward Mississippi and the destiny that had been waiting 23 years for their return. The journey back to Mississippi felt like descending into a recurring nightmare. Samuel had chartered a private train car, knowing this would be their final trip as a family, wanting to spend these last hours in some semblance of the normal life they had briefly enjoyed. Margaret sat by the window, watching the landscape roll past with eyes that seemed to see beyond the physical world. Thomas buried himself in his research notes, still searching for an alternative solution he knew didn't exist. Elizabeth hummed wordless melodies that made the train windows vibrate in their frames. But it was Mary who provided the most unsettling commentary on their return. Now 30 years old but forever changed by her childhood experience, she carried on conversations with reflections in the train's mirrors that only she could see. She's excited, Mary reported about her other self. She says the plantation has been rebuilt, better than before. All the mirrors are whole again, and the tea party room has been expanded to accommodate the entire family. She promises that this time, the crossing will be gentle, like falling asleep and waking up as someone better. As they traveled south, the very air seemed to thicken with supernatural anticipation. Their train passed through towns where every storefront window reflected the same impossible scene. The Fairchild plantation as it had never existed, perfect and eternal, waiting for their return. Children pointed at these windows and spoke of the nice family who lived in the glass house, describing the Fairchilds in detail despite having never met them. The Mirror people had been preparing for this reunion with the thoroughness of master craftsmen. Every reflection across the American South had become a recruitment tool, showing glimpses of the perfect life awaiting anyone willing to step through the dimensional barrier. Several passengers on their train spent the entire journey staring at the windows, their expressions growing more dreamy and distant with each passing mile. When they finally reached the plantation, Samuel hardly recognized the place. The house had been restored to a magnificence that defied architectural possibility. Columns that reached toward the sky like frozen prayers, windows that captured and reflected light in ways that created rainbow patterns in the air, gardens that bloomed with flowers that existed only in the space between reality and dreams. The mirrors were everywhere, but they were no longer confined to the interior of the house. Reflective surfaces adorned every tree, every garden path, every blade of grass, creating an environment where the physical world and the mirror realm existed in perfect harmony. As the Fairchild family approached the front entrance, they could see themselves reflected from hundreds of angles, each showing a slightly different version of who they might become. The door opened before Samuel could knock, revealing a figure that made his heart stop with recognition and revulsion. Ezekiel Fairchild stood in the doorway, but this was Ezekiel as he had never been: tall, strong, radiating health and vitality despite having died over 2 decades earlier. His eyes held the serene confidence of someone who had found perfect peace. "Welcome home, nephew," Ezekiel said, his voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself sing. "We have been waiting so patiently for your return. Come, see what we have built for you." The interior of the house exceeded even Samuel's nightmares in its terrible perfection. Every room had been transformed into a crystalline paradise where families throughout history lived in eternal harmony. The dining room held dinner parties where conversations never grew heated, where children never misbehaved, where love never faded into routine. The music room resonated with compositions that captured every emotion the human heart could experience, then refined those emotions into something purer, more beautiful than mortal feelings could ever be. But it was the playroom that broke Samuel's resolve entirely. Little Mary, the 7-year-old version who had been trapped behind glass for 23 years, sat at an elaborate tea service surrounded by dozens of children from every era of the house's history. They were laughing and playing with the timeless joy of youth, unmarked by pain or loss or the cruel passage of time. The child Mary looked up as they entered and smiled with radiant happiness. "You came back," she exclaimed, running to embrace her older self. "Now we can finally finish our games. I've been saving your favorite chair at the tea table." Samuel watched as his adult daughter knelt to embrace her mirror self, and for a moment, the two Marys overlapped perfectly, creating a single figure that contained both innocence and experience, both the child she had been and the woman she had become. "It's not so bad," the adult Mary whispered to her family. "I can feel her memories, her perfect happiness. She never grew up scared or confused. She never had to learn that the world was cruel or unfair. Maybe she's the real Mary, and I'm just the damaged reflection." Throughout the house, the mirror people had prepared perfect lives for each family member. Thomas found himself in a library that contained every book ever written and many that existed only in the realm of pure thought. The knowledge he had sought his entire adult life lay at his fingertips, along with the certainty that he would have eternity to absorb it all. Elizabeth discovered a music room where her lost abilities had been not just restored but perfected beyond human limitation. She could compose symphonies that created new colors, melodies that healed emotional wounds, harmonies that bridged the gap between mortal understanding and cosmic truth. Margaret was offered the greatest gift of all, a version of herself that had never known the trauma of the mirror realm, never suffered the psychological fractures that had made her feel like a stranger in her own life. This mirror Margaret was whole, confident, radiantly happy in a way the real Margaret had forgotten how to be. "We are not replacing you," Ezekiel explained as the family toured their eternal home. "We are completing you. Every human being exists in fragments, pieces scattered across time, potential, and possibility. We merely gather those pieces and create the definitive version, the self you were always meant to become." But Samuel, even faced with this cosmic temptation, recognized the fundamental flaw in their offer. "What about choice?" he asked. "What about growth, change, the possibility of becoming something new?" Ezekiel's perfect smile flickered slightly. "Choice creates suffering. Change brings loss. Growth requires pain. We offer freedom from all of that existence without the cruel uncertainties that plague mortal life." "But those uncertainties are what make us human," Samuel protested. "Without the possibility of making mistakes, love becomes meaningless. Without the risk of loss, relationships have no weight. You're not offering us perfection. You're offering us a beautiful prison." The temperature in the room dropped perceptibly as every mirror surface in the house reflected the same image. Samuel, but with eyes filled with centuries of patient disappointment. This was not the first time the mirror people had encountered resistance, and they had learned to be persuasive. "Look at your family," Ezekiel commanded, and Samuel saw that his wife and children were already beginning to fade at the edges, becoming translucent as their mirror selves grew more solid. "The crossing has already begun. You can join them willingly and experience the transition as a gentle awakening, or you can fight and watch them disappear piece by piece while you remain behind, alone and haunted by what you have lost." Samuel realized that this had always been the true nature of the trap. The mirror people didn't need to force anyone to cross over. They simply made the alternative too painful to bear. Love itself became their weapon. The human capacity for connection transformed into chains that bound souls to their perfect prison. But as Samuel watched his family fade, he made a choice that the mirror people had never anticipated in all their centuries of careful planning. Instead of fighting the crossing or surrendering to it, he did something that fundamentally altered the rules of the game. He began to remember, not just his memories, but everyone's memories, every person who had ever lived in the plantation, every soul who had been trapped behind glass, every moment of pain and joy and messy human experience that the mirror people had tried to edit out of existence. Samuel opened his mind to the full weight of human imperfection and held it like a shield against the seductive call of artificial paradise. The effect was immediate and devastating. The mirrors throughout the house began to crack as they were forced to reflect not perfection but truth, the accumulated weight of genuine human experience in all its chaotic glory. The mirror people, who existed in a realm of refined possibility, could not withstand contact with the raw authenticity of lived reality. "No!" Ezekiel screamed, but his perfect form was already dissolving. "You don't understand. We were saving you from yourselves. We were offering you eternity." "Eternity without growth isn't life," Samuel replied, his voice growing stronger as his family began to solidify around him. "It's just a very long death." The plantation house collapsed inward on itself, the countless mirrors shattering in a cascade of silver rain. But instead of darkness, the destruction brought light, not the cold perfection of mirror light, but the warm, chaotic glow of genuine sunlight falling on an imperfect world. Samuel found his family huddled together in a field of broken glass, solid and real and beautifully flawed. Margaret's hair was gray, her face lined with years of worry. Thomas looked tired and uncertain, his borrowed knowledge fading like morning mist. Elizabeth's fingers moved silently, searching for melodies she could no longer hear. Mary appeared older, sadder, but finally, completely present in the real world. They were mortal again, vulnerable to time and pain and loss. But they were also free to make mistakes, free to change, free to love imperfectly and find meaning in the very struggles the mirror people had sought to eliminate. As they walked away from the ruins of the plantation, Samuel caught a glimpse of their reflection in a fragment of broken mirror lying in the grass. For just a moment he saw what they might have become, eternal, perfect, empty. Then the reflection faded, leaving only the truth of who they were. A family that had chosen reality over paradise, chaos over control, humanity over perfection. Behind them, the plantation burned with flames that cast no reflections, consuming the last vestiges of a dream that had been too beautiful to be real. The mirror people were gone, returned to whatever realm spawned them, taking with them their offer of eternal happiness in exchange for eternal stagnation. The Fairchild family walked toward an uncertain future, carrying scars that would never fully heal, memories that would forever haunt their dreams. But they walked together and they walked free, and in the end that was enough. In the distance, thunder rumbled across the Mississippi sky, and for the first time in 23 years, Samuel smiled at his reflection in a puddle of rainwater and saw only himself looking back, imperfect, aging, gloriously, defiantly human. The mirrors were broken. The crossing was over. The nightmare had finally come to an end.